Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Alex LaPierre. I'm the program director for a nonprofit Border Community Alliance, and I'm also going to be a presenter today. This subject is a subject that I've been interested in for quite a while. It's kind of the borderlands history that is not taught in school, and I'm really excited about sharing this presentation with you all today about this kind of little known history in terms of really Western history, and particularly the state of Sonora, the northwestern Mexican state of Sonora. So we're gonna jump right into it. I'm gonna share my screen here. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box during the presentation, or alternatively, if you want to hold them till the end, there'll be a Q&A session at the very end as well. So here we go. Awesome. Hopefully you can see my screen here. Awesome. Well, this image that you see here to begin my presentation is a mural that I took a picture of just this last October 2020 in Guaymas. And the town of Guaymas, probably the most famous port city of the state of Sonora, is actually known as Heroica Guaymas, for the role that it played, the really important role that it played in defending the integrity of the Mexican nation, particularly in this mid-19th century period that we're going to be talking about today. In the northern Sonoran town of Calorica on April 7th, 1857, Henry Alexander Crabbe stood with his hands tied above his head to a post in front of him, his back turned to a firing squad. Moments later, some hundreds of bullets riddled his body. A Mexican severed Crabbe's head from his body, allowing the crowd to jeer at it. Afterwards, the head was preserved in mezcal. The bodies of Crabbe's men, who had also been executed that day, lay unburied and eaten by birds and hogs outside the cemetery walls at Calorica. 4 other Americans who had remained on the American side of the border were executed a few days later when Mexican troops crossed the international boundary to find them. And this was reported by the San Diego Herald in May 9th, 1857. So today, kind of an overview of how this presentation is gonna work. We're first gonna talk about the word filibuster, which is going on actually right now in Washington, D.C., is what I heard in the news. We're gonna look at a little bit about the context of the situation, the background, the setting and timeline to orientate you. And then we'll look at kind of paving the way for the most famous filibusters, 2 different expeditions that were headed up by Frenchmen, Charles de Pindar and Lepine de Segondis. And then we'll talk about the filibusteros. So primarily Gaston de Rasuet, about Bourbon, and then also Henry A. Crabbe, which you just heard about from that article in the San Diego Herald. And then finally, we're going to look at the last French intervention, the French invasion, the second French intervention in Mexico, which lasted between 1861 and 1867, kind of this post-filibustering era when the French were up here in Sonora as well. And we're going to look at some of the principal battles that took place in Sonora during that period. And then finally, we'll look at the legacy of this situation. I'm just gonna stop sharing and check and see if we got someone. Yeah, we've got an extra person here. I'm gonna admit them into the, there we go. Alrighty, back at it here. So the word filibuster, most of us know it from the theatrics in Washington, but today we're going to be looking at the kind of the secondary meaning of the word, this historical meaning, which is a person engaging in unauthorized warfare against a foreign country. And then you can kind of see there from the etymology, it's you know, kind of this idea of kind of pirating, basically from this kind of, you know, the Latin America going back into the colonial times is where the origin of the word comes from. So kind of setting the stage for this really fascinating part of the history, you really have to look at the context of the Mexican-American War, which took place in the decade prior. So Mexico loses over half of its national territory in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, is really weakened by their defeat. And then on top of that, they kind of have an untenable defense situation on the northern boundary against the Apaches, particularly in Sonora and Chihuahua. And what they kind of do to help alleviate this situation, is one of the solutions they come up with is issuing invitations to foreigners to develop the land and improve defense and economy. And the key on those foreigners is non-Americans. The Mexicans were kind of still, you have to kind of put yourself in their shoes after this really devastating war. And then the goal of that was really to aid retention of the borders from further American encroachment. And then some background, you also have the California gold rush going on in 1848, which was really a magnet for people and really opportunists from around the world. Many of those people included French fortune seekers. And however, after the arrival, a lot of the French gained disillusionment with the lack of ease to riches, like many others did, and the anti-foreign sentiment by Americans that they experienced. And so why Sonora, right? What was the motivation behind this interest by foreigners in Sonora? Well, it was the mineral wealth of the Sierra Madre Mountains. So, Sonora was really kind of emerging as the second best thing to a lot of these failed miners in California. And, they kind of changed out the Sierra Nevada for the Sierra Madre. And another thing to keep in mind too is this was a frontier region that was, kind of perceived to be precariously possessed by the nascent country of Mexico, which had won its independence only in 1821. But also kind of the combination between the Apaches and then also the fact that Mexico was weakened after the Mexican-American War. And then to kind of orientate you a little bit here to the area that we're going to be talking about, it's a lot of these filibusteros entered through the port of Guaymas, which you can see there in the blue circle. It's one of the best natural harbors in northwestern Mexico. In fact, the Mexican Navy still has ships and installation there as well. That's where many of the French expeditions entered through. Another important place we're going to talk about is Calorica there in western Sonora. That's, of course, was the site of the battle that I described from the crab, from the Herald extraction, San Diego Herald. And then we'll also be talking about kind of the important cities of Hermosillo, Urres, and Alamos. And then the stars that you see there were actually the destinations for the French expeditions. The yellow star was where the Count Rousset Bourbon was after, which was the old mining Real de Arizona. The purple star is Cocospera, which was an abandoned mission site, Kino mission. And then also the green star you have, it was Santa Cruz, Sonora. It's on just the other side of the border from Nogales in the loop of the Santa Cruz River. And they were all aiming for that areas, of course, because of the mining riches to be had there. So the first French colonization initiative in Sonora was led by Charles de Pindar. Basically, the situation in France is what really propelled him to leave the country. There was a really famous revolution in 1848, and then also, of course, economic depression. And that is what really mobilized a lot of these Frenchmen to immigrate abroad, especially at the news of the California gold rush. And he was descended from nobility from the Poitou region. He was known as the Marquis or Marqués de Pindar. He departed from France actually a little bit earlier than the gold rush, 1846, but he ended up there. And he was prospecting in California, and he leverages his abilities basically there when he wasn't able to make riches right away. He didn't find the streets paved in gold. So he used his abilities as a huntsman, a marksman, to make a living hunting, supplying the markets of the young city of San Francisco. And while he was there, he was actually encouraged by Mexican diplomats, as we mentioned, this kind of strategy that they developed to help settle this frontier. So technically, he wasn't a filibustero. So he later arrives in Guaymas in December 1851 with about 80 settlers, mainly Frenchmen, a few Americans interspersed as well. He was joined by other foreigners in the port and was provisioned. And so he heads north to found this agricultural colony at Cocospera. He reoccupies the abandoned mission, fortifies it, and basically to serve as a frontline defense against the Apaches. And the idea was to set it up initially as an agricultural colony in order to basically supply future mining ventures. However, the Mexican government failed to provide the promised aid. They're kind of ended the bargain for coming out. And he later died mysteriously from a bullet near Rayon, Sonora, a little bit north east of Hermosillo, on a trip to Ures. And local officials attributed it to a suicide. However, there's many doubts that exist that it was a suicide. People think that he was probably killed. And actually, this picture is a picture I took of his gravestone. That's actually normally at the Unison, the University of Sonora's regional museum. Here it was on display at the Museum of Art of Sonora in Hermosillo. And this is where the destination was Cocospora. It was an ideal fertile valley, but it was very dangerous. They were raided and attacked on multiple occasions, and so Pindar going down to Ores was seeking support that was promised and never came about. So the second French colonization initiative was by another French agent for a mining company in San Francisco named Lepine de Segondis. He also worked out a deal with the Mexican officials, the diplomats there in San Francisco, to reoccupy a lot of the abandoned mines due to the Apache pressure. And so he later departs San Francisco for Guaymas. He has basically about the same amount of people as Charles de Pindre had. And people are starting to see that a lot of the foreigners in San Francisco are starting to see that the Mexican government is really open to this new strategy, and that there's possibly riches to be had. Of course, if they're able to defend against the Apache and make these mines that had been abandoned reactive again. And you can't really say these were filibustering because they were kind of on the government, the Mexican government. It was a bargain, a deal that they made, but they kind of led way to the real filibustering. And this expedition was headed for Santa Cruz, Sonora, which is a really nice town on the loop of the Santa Cruz River, just on the Mexican side. And a lot of the participants of these two expeditions would later go on to join the real filibustero, which was the Count Gaston de Rosset Bourbon. And so he was born in Avignon, France. He was from a Provençal noble family. He kind of had that typical reckless youth in Paris, and he left for adventure in French colonial Algiers. Of course, the revolution hits in France, and so as nobility, he kind of gets out of Dodge and he comes to California. And he also, kind of connects with Pindre and Segondis. And he later becomes really kind of sold by this idea of going to Sonora, not quite making it in California with the expected, riches that they sought to make. And so he leaves in 1852 for Sonora, with this time about double the last of the two expeditions. And this at this first expedition was kind of on the, again, as well with the Mexican government. But again, they're kind of being stonewalled the whole time that they're there and on their way to Saric, which is the old famous silver mine, Spanish colonial silver mine of the Real de Arizona. And so all this stonewalling and lack of promise fulfillment basically provokes him to raise arms. And he realizes that, that the situation there in Sonora is really precarious and that he can likely take it over. This what's really now the second biggest state in Mexico, with the few, maybe 250 Frenchmen that he's got there. And so he goes down and successfully captures Hermosillo with a force, the six of the size of the defense of Hermosillo. However, he falls ill. He loses some of the key officers of his men in the battle. So he ends up making a truce or an accord with the Mexican government, and he eventually departs to San Francisco. But when he gets back to San Francisco, his kind of exploits are kind of, he's feted, he's celebrated. A lot of people think that this idea that he has of taking over Sonora is possible, and so he gears up for a second expedition. However, the Mexican forces are ready for him this second time, and they actually meet him right there at disembarkment in Guaymas on his second arrival in Sonora. And there's a battle, and he ended up getting captured, and later he is also executed by a firing squad in Guaymas. And here's a historic photo of Guaymas in the mid-19th century. And his whole effort was actually backed by Swiss banker financing, and you can see the flag that he made there for his kind of idea of a French state in Sonora. And then you can see some scenes here from the Battle of Hermosillo, which he was successful in, and then later on the second arrival back in Sonora when he was judged and executed by Mexican forces. And so we're going to shift now from talking about the French to the American filibusteros, and there's another famous one called William Walker. He was more active in Baja California and Central America, so I'm going to actually focus mainly on Henry A. Crabb, who was born in Nashville, Tennessee. He was a lawyer, both a lawyer and a politician, a member of the famous Know Nothing Party. He was living in Stockton, California at the time, and he was really unsuccessful in his bid for re-election for the California state legislature. However, he had married into a wealthy and influential Sonoran family. I believe it was the Ainza family. And it was via these connections that he sought to take advantage of a civil war that was going on in Sonora, which was actually Mexico's greater reform war. And so he offered military support basically in exchange for land to the liberal forces under Ignacio Pesquera. However, when Crabb's gearing up to help him and getting on his way, Pesquera ends up gaining the upper hand before Crabb's help arrives, and against the conservatives under Gándara, and who just before the arrival of him into Sonora. And given this change in situation, the kind of the optics of inviting American mercenaries really looks bad from a Mexican perspective in the decade after the Mexican-American War. So he ends up turning up against the Crabb force, and of course we know kind of what happens. He ends up being executed and decapitated, and his head being placed in a glass jar of mezcal to serve as a warning for future filibustering efforts against the state of Sonora or Mexico. And so he had recruited about 100 men for this Arizona colonization company, but the original plan was to recruit 1,000 for the venture, and it was to be a two-pronged venture, one by sea, arriving in Guaymas, and the other by land. However, he only recruits 100. He takes those 100 by ship from San Francisco to LA to San Diego, and then he proceeds overland by the Southern Immigrant Trail to Sonora. And actually today in Arizona, there's still a location known as the Filibusters camp, which was one of the historic campsites of the expedition along this route. And it's it's kind of in between Interstate 8 freeway and the Gila River, and it's just east of the community of Welton, Arizona. So that's one kind of geographic reference that we still have today in Arizona that persists about this really lesser known era. And so on his way down, he eventually meets Mexican forces in Calorica, which was founded as a mission by Quino in 1693 at the base of Cerro Prieto Mountain. And this is where the Mexicans in O'odham make a stand, basically. They attack the Crabb's forces, but then they quickly retreat to the safety of the mission. And there's basically a 6-day siege that takes place. The Americans fortified themselves in an adobe house just in front of the temple, and they kind of failed at their one attempt to gain entry via the convento of the church with a barrel of gunpowder that doesn't explode. And Jim Griffith has collected kind of folklore stories that they say that a woman in blue, so the Virgin Mary, of course, the patroness of the temple, was the one that was able to somehow prevent the fuse from lighting for that to gain entry. And so all through this, the Mexican reinforcements arrive from Altar, and basically they rally. And what happens is an O'odham fires a flaming arrow at the house that they had fortified themselves, the filibusters. And at that point, the Americans give up. They surrender, basically. And you can kind of see that here in this image, this painting. And all members of the filibustering expedition were ended up being executed. There were approximately 50 survivors in the battle, and the Mexican military basically just let one 16-year-old American boy return to California to basically tell the tale as a warning for others. And this is an image of the facade of the temple there in Calorica, and you can still see the bullet holes to this day where they lined up the filibusteros and executed them. And so that was kind of the end of the filibustering era, but it wasn't quite the end of this invasion by foreigners. And so in 1862, you had the French invasion, and it was kind of the whole invasion was actually with the French, the English, and the Spanish as well, and it was over a lot of kind of debts due by Mexico to these different European countries, and but quickly the other two countries realized that it wasn't just to retrieve a debt. France's involvement in invading Mexico, and so they leave and they see that they have more kind of bigger imperial designs, and of course Napoleon III appoints a family member, Maximilian of Austria, and this is considered the Second Empire, right after the First Empire, which is the New Spain, the Spanish colonial empire, and so the French were right from the very beginning interested in Sonora, and this was because they were aware of the mineral riches that Sonora had, and so of course they wanted to extract them. And this is actually an article from the New York Times in 1862 that references the fact that the French had arrived in the port of Guaymas, the French Pacific Fleet. And so in 1865, after occupying the port, they actually land and take over the port of Guaymas. And there's two really big battles. The first battle, which was a French and imperial victory, was in Alamos, a really important community in southern Arizona, southern Sonora, mining community. And it's interesting because a lot of the natives in the native groups in the state of Sonora actually joined the French imperial cause. And so one of the imperial leaders there was actually an Opata, Tanori, that was a general. And then the second real big battle, which was a defeat for the French imperial forces, and this takes place kind of in the waning years of the French occupation. It's in September 4th of 1866, and it was a strategic importance, Ures, that's where it took place, which was the capital at the time of Sonora. And of course, they also were given the name Heroica for this role that the community had in defending the patria, right? And so this is actually from the museum in Ures. There's some great murals that depict the battle that took place. And when you go to Hermosillo, the capital, you have a lot of these surnames for a lot of the streets, and a lot of the surnames are honoring these military heroes of Sonora through the past, through the Reform War, through the French occupation, etc. And what's really interesting about this battle is that the commander of the French forces wasn't actually French. He was actually Danish. His name was Emil Langberg. He was born in Copenhagen, and he had arrived in Mexico, where his brother, on the invitation of his brother, he had learned, however, when he arrived that the brother had been murdered, and so he was hired to survey and plat Matamoros, and his abilities really kind of caught the attention of the local elite, including the military. And so he kind of starts to raise the ranks of the military, becoming a professor, and kind of had a lot of different important friends in politics, served in the Mexican-American War, and then was sent back north as border inspector with the new delineation of the new border as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And he kind of becomes disillusioned with Maximilian, and he had hoped for actually Yankee intervention, since at this time the Union had won the Civil War after 1865, but he dies in battle on the plains of Guadalupe de Juarez, just outside of the town of Juarez today. And so, what are the legacy of this kind of this interesting era in Sonora's history? Well, you kind of have this interesting phenomenon in Mexico of the government bestowing this term heroic onto these cities for the role that they played. So you have about 5 Sonoran communities with that term in Mexico out of 46 total. So Sonora has always played a really significant part in the history of Mexico. You can really say about that too. And of course, one of them is Guaymas as well, the port city there. And if you ever get a chance to visit there, you can kind of get a sense in the old city of the real strategic nature of this port city, and how it was really kind of a commercial and trade center. And you can see that here by this great picture of the bank from the later 1800s. And every April 6th in Caborca, they have really what's the city's big festivity in Caborca, the municipal government's big festivity, which is making the celebration that they had been victorious in defeating the filibusteros. And so they have music and entertainment and cultural events there in Caborca, and so it's definitely an interesting place to go and visit during these times. Probably better now as an American than back in the 1850s. Here's some of my works cited, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about this. Alrighty, so I don't have any questions, it looks like, right here in the chat. Anyone want to unmute?
I had a question for you.
Sure. Go ahead, Sandy.
Are you familiar with, in your research, did you run across any references to the town of Bacahuachi? I believe some of the filibusters may have gotten land grants or settled in Bacahuachi. I know they did in Cocosboro. Mm-hmm. I was just wondering if you had run across anything in reference to that specific town.
No, but I did run into the fact that a lot of them ended up staying in Sonora.
They did.
Yeah, and I've met people in Tucson that have, they say they have French ancestry from Sonora, and yes, it really has to do with these miners that just ended up staying. In fact, the Count fell in love with the daughter of the prefect of Altar, who is this blonde they talk about, and he actually was there during the fiestas of Magdalena, during the pilgrimage, and so there is weight to that kind of. Oftentimes you hear people have French heritage from northern Mexico, and
yes.
Yeah.
I know of one family in specific that I can trace back to Bacahuachi in the 1860s, and the name is French. I haven't been able to get back to any land grant records yet, so I was just curious about that specific town.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because even before the French, there was a lot of Italians even in Hermosillo. It was really English as well, and so it was kind of cosmopolitan, and a lot had to do with the mineral wealth that Sonora had, the reputation that it had. So, but yeah, Bacahuachi, it's very likely because that's kind of in that near area from Cocos.
It is.
Yeah, and Arispe was a big center as well, and Bacahuachi is just the next town up, so I could see definitely people settling in there.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for joining. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting that I caught in the news today that they were filibustering the January 6th commission today in Washington. So I was like, wow, I guess it was an appropriate day to pick this presentation for that. But I think, you hear those stories about the gold rush and how really the people that struck it rich were the people that actually sold to the miners, like, Levi Strauss, et cetera, is the kind of the big example. And so there was this kind of, a lot of these single young men, they're adventurers in Sonora and San Francisco. And the next best thing for a lot of them was coming down to Sonora. And it just was really the real issue at hand was this kind of the fact that the Sonorans weren't able to really withstand the pressure from the Apaches raiding from the north. And so this was really a strategy that the Mexican government came up with to help revitalize that mining economy and also defend the new borders of the country. So. Awesome. Well, if you have any questions, you can later. You can also write me at my email. I'll do a follow-up email. But thank you all so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.